Finally, I want to end off by looking at some of the options that are available under the Options section in the File menu. So in the Interface tab, under General, we can click this to reset this to a default size. We have the Info pane language at the bottom. It'll default to your system, or you can set it to these languages. And we can also open the library browser when we're opening empty contact instances, and also enable the New Instruments for You panel. That's what we see down here, or we can hide it. Now, on the Engine page, we have a default volume for New Instruments, and -6 dB is the default, but you can create them louder if you want, and you have to reinstantiate Contact for that to take effect. And then we have overload protection. Once the CPU starts getting maxed out, you want it to start killing voices if the CPU load is very light, is high, or is somewhat high. Otherwise, you might get crackling. And multiprocessor support, it's generally handled by the DAW, but you can set it to whatever number of cores you have based on the hardware you're using. And when we send MIDI to the outside world, we can send either only the scripted CCs in the scripts, or the notes in the scripts, or the GUI keyboard, or incoming CCs or incoming notes through the MIDI out functionality in Contact. And it's an advanced function we haven't looked at in this series. Offline interpolation, when you're bouncing, do you want it to be the same as real time, or you can have high, perfect, or standard for the quality when bouncing offline. And when we're editing samples, it's a good idea to store all edited samples from a session whenever you save it. And here's the pathway for where it'll store those samples. This is the default, but of course you can click here and just set it to wherever you want. Now on the handling page, we can use the QWERTY keyboard to generate MIDI when that's enabled, and this will set the velocity that it's going to be sending when you hit your QWERTY keyboard. Solo mode, when we're soloing multiple instruments, in place means only one will be soloed at a time, and if you start clicking the solo button on multiple instruments in latch mode, they'll maintain their solo status so you can solo more than one at a time. This determines what order files and folders are shown in the side pane browser, and when we're creating new instruments from scratch, again, which we haven't looked at, you can set the default root key for new zones. And then this is important, the default MIDI channel assignment for loaded patches. Now you'll be aware that every time I loaded an instrument, the MIDI input defaulted to Omni. And that's great if you want to layer sounds, but you can also assign it to first free, which is great if you want to start loading a bunch of instruments in and have them all go to subsequent MIDI channels to create a multi-timbral kind of instance of Contact in a multi-mode. But that's the default for now, and then you can also keep Contact 1 patch assignments. You can enable undo, which will increase the CPU load, so it's off by default, but you'll have an undo with that enabled. And you can also set to an external wave editor. Again, this is for advanced editing in custom instruments. Next up on the loading tab, we can merge new multis with existing one if you're opening several multis. And you can also ask for confirmation when you're replacing or closing modified instruments. It's a good idea if you're editing instruments and you're not sure if you want to save them or not. You'll be prompted with a warning sign when that's enabled. Now, this is important. When we double-click instruments, again, you'll be noticing throughout the series that as I've double-clicked, it replaces the current instrument, which is the default. But with this off, it'll create new instruments every time you double-click and load one. And that's great in conjunction with the setting that we have here for the MIDI channels. If you want to assign new MIDI channels to each instrument, again, if you're building up a multi-timbral multi, you might set this to assign to first free, and then on loading, have this disabled. You can load samples in the background. That's great, so you can start playing them right away. Convert third-party samples like Rex to WAV format. These are all options that are on by default. And if you're loading instruments that use the same automation ID, this will be great because it'll kind of automatically reassign them for you so that there's no conflicts. So good idea to leave that one on. Now we have non-player content base path. So when you're working with content that's not in your pathway for Contact, you can set a path over here and you can store the paths over here when you're saving within your DAW. It'll help resolve file references if any samples are missing or in different locations. It's a good idea to click this enabled so that it'll remember the pathway to whatever you have loaded in. Now in the Libraries tab, if you're working with all the complete instruments, it can get very crowded. You can selectively enable or disable specific libraries from appearing in your browsers. So if you have a lot of content, it's a great way of potentially restricting some in case maybe you're working on a big project and you're not going to be using a certain category or class of libraries. You can disable them. So it's just a way to customize what is going to appear in your browser. And you could also launch native access from here in case you need to reload or activate any libraries. Now, memory, this will allow you to override the preload buffer that's set up with each instrument library. In general, there's no need to use this. It's good to leave it off, but if you want, you can override it and set a preload buffer size that's custom here. Now, in the developer pane, you can enable specific features if you're developing your own Kontakt libraries, but that goes way beyond the scope of this series. And finally, Kontakt collects data regarding your usage of the software so that they can use it for future updates, and you can send this data to native instruments to help make future versions better, or it's your choice to disable it if you want. So this is Eli Kranzberg signing out. I hope you've enjoyed these videos, and I hope you've picked up some ideas on how you can get the most out of the user experience in this fantastic new updated version of Kontakt. Have fun, make great music, and I'll see you for more next time.